inviting me here tonight. It's about 3 in the morning London time and I've literally just got off the plane, so forgive me if I'm a little bleary-eyed, and I'll try and be as brief as possible because I realise dinner is waiting. I should start really by telling you a little bit about my connection with Sri Lanka, which goes back quite a long way to 2000. And in telling you how I first came to Sri Lanka, I should first remember a journalist, a colleague who's no longer with us, who was killed in Sri Lanka. And I remember Nimalrajan Malvaganam, the BBC's correspondent in Jaffna, who was killed in his home while listening to his report on the radio in Tamil coming back in the middle of a high security zone. And when his family were attacked, it took them an hour to get to the hospital because there were so many checkpoints around his home. And those checkpoints didn't stop the armed men coming into his house and attacking him and killing him. You want me to go closer? Okay. This was the backdrop against which I went to Sri Lanka, a dead colleague and his family to deal with. I arrived in Colombo with a 3-month-old baby and my husband, and we had bomb film fitted on the walls of the windows of our house. I took flak jackets and helmets along with, nappies and baby bottles. It was quite a surreal environment. We had security guards around the clock, and there were quite a lot of threats. My predecessor had death threats, my successor had death threats. After a year in Sri Lanka during the war in 2000, 2001, the Sri Lankan government told me that my visa would not be renewed, that I would have to leave. Unfortunately for them, my visa ran out literally the day before general elections, parliamentary elections, so they extended it for a little bit to see me through the elections. And of course, as you know, a different government came to power, and I got a reprieve. And that was when the peace process started, and in a way I was one of the luckiest BBC correspondents in Sri Lanka because I had access to the tigers, to the war zone, and I could travel back and forth all over the country. And I made very good use of that access. And I'll tell you a little bit, just as an anecdote, about my first trip to Kilinochchi to see the tigers. I had to have a letter from the Ministry of Defence that the approval for that trip went right up to the Prime Minister. It was such a big deal to allow the BBC to go to Kilinochchi. I took that letter, we crossed the checkpoint, we went through the no-man's zone, we got to the tigers. It was quite exciting to see them for the first time. And the first thing they asked me for was a copy of my letter from the Sri Lankan government, from the Ministry of Defence. And I thought, how bizarre. This is, a rebel force. They don't recognise the authority of the Ministry of Defence and they want this piece of paper. So they took it away and they photocopied it. We went to Kilinochchi. They, very media savvy, they'd arranged a release of prisoners of war and we reported on the story. And then they said, okay, now you have to go back to another town, Malawi, because we don't have anywhere for you to stay here. And that meant another 2 hours in a bumpy car going back, and we begged them. We said, no, 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 please, we'll sleep on the floor in sleeping bags. You don't have to give us beds, it's okay. And then they said, okay, hold on a minute. And we heard this banging and this sawing and carpentry noise, hammering. And we were sitting in the garden, it was getting late, and we were waiting, to go to bed. And we were making jokes, we were getting a bit lightheaded, and we were making jokes about how they were putting up some beds for us. And actually that's what it was. They were putting up 4-poster beds with mosquito nets. We took over Dire Master's office and it became our bedroom, basically. And that was the sort of first taste of hospitality there. Now, during the years, I went back and forth to the Vani. I reported on it a great deal. I got to know them very well. I then left in 2004 and I was posted to Iran. And then, of course, the tsunami happened, and I begged to go back to Sri Lanka. I wanted to go back to Kilinochchi and Mulativu to report on what had happened there. And that was my last trip, and the last time I saw many of those people alive. Having said that, while I was in Iran, the tigers kept in touch with me. They kept on ringing me. Actually, I would say that one of them was, the tigers were the people who introduced me to Skype first, and they made very good use of it. And always technologically advanced. Then I went back to London and they kept in touch through Skype. And as the war drew to its climax in 2008, 2009, I was in almost daily or every few days contact with Pulidevan, the head of the political wing, the peace secretary, head of the peace secretariat at the LTT. And he would ring me sometimes on his satellite phone in the middle of the night. You'd hear bombs going off in the background, or he would just Skype. He wanted really, I think, to be in touch with somebody from the old days. He wanted to have a taste of normality, to talk to somebody who wasn't there. And of course, I wanted to know what was going on. I was pressing him to know, what the plan was, what was going to happen, what was actually happening on the ground. And of course now, having written this book, I know that I had no idea how bad it was. I had no idea what these people were going through. I watched all the video, I saw the news reports, but until I started piecing together the story later, I didn't really know what it was like. I hoped that he would survive. I hoped that all those people would survive. And the last time I spoke to him was on the 13th of May, 2009, and he sent me a photograph of himself in a bunker. And I was quite shocked because he looked so thin, and there were clearly bloodstains on the cloth behind him in the bunker. And part of me knew why he sent me that photo. He sent me the photo because he knew it would be for his obituary. And part of me understood that, although I didn't wish to accept it. And when he was killed and I heard that news, I sent it to AFP, Agence France Presse, and they put it out on the wire, and it was the last known photograph of him alive. I waited after the war. I watched to see what would happen. I listened to my colleagues in Sri Lanka telling me about Manic Farm refugee camp. I couldn't believe that another injustice was compounded by a fresh one. And then I waited. I saw the UN Human Rights Council pat Sri Lanka on the back, congratulate them. I looked in horror. And I waited and waited and waited to see what the world would do. And by 2010, I couldn't really see anything happening. And by chance, I didn't know what I could do as an individual, as a journalist, and I was no longer in the BBC at that time. I met a friend who'd written a book about the Bangladesh liberation struggle many years later, and I was talking to her about her book, and suddenly the penny dropped. I thought, okay, the one thing I can do is I can write a book. I can try and fill in that gap, that black hole in history, those 5-6 months when nobody really knows exactly what happened. It's not recorded. There were not enough witnesses to that. So I went off and decided to write this book. And a lot of people said to me, why do you bother? All my Iranian journalist friends were like, why are you bothering to write a book about Sri Lanka? They didn't get it at all. And I thought I was late to the story. I thought a year after an event, it was far too late to do that. But actually it was the perfect time because many people were beginning to escape the country, especially the expatriates Tamils who'd been caught up in the war. They got out first. And through them, I went to interview the first person in London. She told me her story. I spent days interviewing the poor woman because I couldn't believe her story. It was so extraordinary. And then I went through her. She introduced me to somebody else, and I went around the world, throughout Europe and Australia, meeting people, each story worse, more unimaginable than the last one. I realized that every single person had an extraordinary tale if they'd walked out of that war alive. I listened to a nun who told me her story in a whisper, actually. For 2 days, she whispered. She couldn't bring herself to say it openly, the kind of evil she'd confronted. She was destroyed. She told me she had nightmares after I came to see her. I'm afraid that's the effect I had on many people I interviewed. I met a sea tiger who was suicidal, and it was shocking to see someone so strong reduced to that. I saw people who were incredibly courageous. They brought their children through this war, and they somehow led them through that. And what I hadn't, of course, realized when I started was that the story wasn't just those last roughly 6 months of the war. The story was also how people escaped from Manic Farm refugee camp, and everybody had the most extraordinary tales of paying bribes, of course, but also smuggling in mortuary vans, in ambulances, climbing under barbed wire with their sick children, and then hiding in Colombo, and then getting to India, and then paying human smugglers, going around the world in fear, always, and trying to get to safety. So the tales were epic of survival. I found these people broken, destroyed, courageous to the extreme, but also shattered by their experiences. And it was really distressing to interview them. For me, at times I had to confront things that I found very difficult to believe. The deliberate bombing, repeated bombing of hospitals, extremely difficult to countenance that and to actually get your head around something so monstrous in a way. I found it, I was very angry to listen to that. It took a huge personal toll on me to tell these stories. I would wake up early in the morning, angry, clenched my fists about what I'd heard. Obviously worrying also about these people who took enormous risks to talk to me. Enormous risks now, of course, that the book is published, that there'll be some sort of retribution against their extended families. And many of them didn't want to use their real names, but it's quite difficult to disguise some of these people. So, this is the story that I told. I'm going to read you a portion from the book. It's a story of 10 people, but obviously I interviewed a lot more than that. It's called Still Counting the Dead, and obviously at one level that's because we simply do not know how many people died in this last phase of the war. The UN estimates 40,000. Yasmin Suka, one of the authors of that report at my launch in London, said it could possibly be 75,000. And we know the Bishop of Manor has talked about 147,000 people missing. So all those figures make it one of the worst atrocities of this century, and yet who has heard of Mulavikul? Everybody's heard of Srebrenica, but nobody's heard of this place. So Still Counting the Dead is really a reference to this amazing number of people that nobody knows how many it is, but also to making the dead count for something, because that's why everybody spoke to me and took these risks. I'm going to read you a little portion, or the beginning of the chapter, from the doctor, who, in my mind, is an incredible hero, and someone that you ought to be honouring, not me, but him, actually. It was in the lobby of an empty hotel on a windswept, rainy Atlantic coast that I'd arranged to meet the Tamil doctor. A political refugee from the tropical jungles of northern Sri Lanka, he now lives in a tranquil landscape of pine trees and glaciers. Wrapped in a thick fleece against the damp chill outside, the doctor was extremely nervous about delving back into the past. He'd just been through a month of intensive trauma counselling. There were times when he'd contemplated suicide. On several occasions during our interview, he had to break off to visit the bathroom and wash his face to control the emotions he was reliving. 2 years on, the doctor still recounted the war through traumatized flashbacks, the anecdotes exploding in random order in his memory, zigzagging back and forth across the months. He rushed to describe each one quickly before it faded again. Often, he seemed to be actually back in the war zone, seeing the scenes of horror flash in front of him, constantly pulling himself back into the present. These snapshots were punctuated by apologetic, high-pitched laughter. Short, dark and balding, with big eyes peering watchfully from behind a prominent nose, you wouldn't know he was a hero. He looked like an ordinary 47-year-old man, even a little plump, a far cry from the emaciated figure who escaped at the end of the war. Though he had many opportunities to flee, he chose to stay to the end in order to save lives, believing he himself would not survive. Pieces of shrapnel narrowly missed him as he operated in makeshift field hospitals. He's convinced they were deliberately attacked, even though he repeatedly gave the Sri Lankan government details of their positions so they'd be spared. He calculates that his team of doctors, nurses, and medics saved at least 20,000 people, but he is tormented by 150 patients he abandoned under a tree on the very last day of the war. He wants to forget the hands clawing at his sarong, the voices asking to be rescued as he tore himself away and ran through a hail of bullets to surrender to the Sri Lankan army. Now in exile, living in safety with his wife and 3 daughters on icy, unfamiliar shores, he is still fearful for his extended family back in Sri Lanka. Call me Neeron, I have to be careful. Any problem caused by me and they'll take revenge, he says, referring to the Sri Lankan authorities. Recently, one friend told me that the police came with my photograph and showed it to him, asking if he'd seen me. That was after I'd left. They were looking for me, but it was too late. At first, they were searching for the Tiger leaders. We were the second priority. Now they realize our importance as witnesses. He was one of just a few government doctors who stayed on throughout the war to serve their people. Even though the northern jungles had been under rebel administration for years, such was the power of the government bureaucracy that it still deployed doctors and civil servants in these areas. Increasingly desperate, on rare occasions, the doctors spoke out about the carnage in telephone interviews with the international media. At the end of the war, the other doctors were captured and forced by the Sri Lankan government to retract everything they'd said. Neeron was the one who slipped through the net. At first, Dr. Neeron worked in proper hospitals, the patients lying on clean sheets in beds, tended by nurses in starched white uniforms. Soon he was setting up makeshift operating theatres in public buildings, homes, tents, and then finally in the open, under a tree. By the end, many of the nurses were dead, and the doctors were amputating limbs without anaesthetic, using butcher's knives. I'm going to probably stop at this point and spare you because I think you're waiting for dinner, but one thing I want to say is that I've been obviously very concerned about this man's or his relative's safety since the publication of the book. And I think it's worth noting the kind of risks that all these people in this book have taken. Yes, he hasn't used his real name, but it's not that difficult to figure out who he is in a place as small as Jaffna. So I would really, commend to you the bravery of people like that, not only in the war, but so traumatized afterwards that they're still willing to come forward and bear witness in this way. And I think it's really important that their contribution is recognized. And I would say a little bit now about the reaction to my book. Interestingly, there have been a few comments from Colombo, a few people who say that I'm making money out of dead people and that kind of thing. But on the whole, I would say the most critical reaction has actually, surprisingly to me, been from Tamils in the diaspora. And I think that's quite concerning, because this is a book where, I'm an outsider, I'm trying to tell your story, or the story of what happened to these people, to a wider audience, because otherwise it's just a conversation between the same people again and again. I think it's really important that people beyond the Sri Lankan community understand what happened in Mullawaikul in 2009. And yet the response from some people in Europe has been very critical, because they say this book has in a sense depoliticized the story. And to that I would say that they have dehumanized the story, and that actually it's not about the war is not about just politics, it's also about individual human lives, and it's very important that that's recognized. And I think it's disturbing that, and as a lot of outsiders who come into this field and who want to get involved and help, get quite badly attacked by some very extreme voices in the community who basically can't tolerate different points of view or want their particular politics to be superimposed on the stories and on the experiences. So I think one of the things that Yasmin Suka, the UN panel report, mentioned at the launch of my book was that what the Tamil community internationally has not yet done is really create a wider solidarity movement, much like she did during the anti-apartheid movement, with others, of course, in South Africa, where a lot of people identified with the cause and came forward and contributed. And there are now, of course, people like me, like Channel 4, like Roma Tern, the novelist who's Sri Lankan of an origin, like the Sri Lanka campaign in Europe, who are trying to get engaged in this sphere. And it doesn't help when basically you're attacked for not following the party line. So with humble forgiveness, I would like to kind of submit the book to your scrutiny, but I'd also say, forgive the fact that it's an outsider's view and tolerate that, tolerate any differences of opinion, please. That's it.